Hi everybody. Just wanted to thank you once again for your patience as we're figuring out a way to make this new arrangement work. What I've decided to do is to try my hand at videoing a lecture through some of the material that we would be covering over the next few weeks. This is the first time that I've done this like this, and so hopefully it all works out. Obviously, if you have any questions, be sure to let me know, shoot me an email. I'll do my best to address anything content-wise or how the structure of the class is going to go or any of that stuff. I will say I am fighting a bit of a cold, and it's not anything more than that, I'm pretty sure, so fingers crossed. But so it's probably good for everybody that I'm not on campus spreading any of that around. So like I said, so we'll try to make this work, and there's actually going to be a couple of changes between the slides that are regularly available on Blackboard for these different sections and what I'm going to be doing for these video lectures. Please make sure that you're looking at the full set of slides so that when the exams roll around and that kind of thing, you're going to get all of that content. I'm using these video recordings, these audio recordings, as a way to really introduce the essential components of the topics. But since especially the exam coming up is going to be online, it's going to be really important for you to be confident in the material, you know, in a pretty thorough way, because you're going to have a lot more opportunity to dig into these questions and answers and things when you're finishing up those answers on the test. So there's going to be 2 recordings of the Jackson material. So this is going to be the first, and we'll go through a handful of slides, and the other recording will be available as a separate file. Each one, you know, I'm looking for sort of the 20-minute, 25-minute range, so we'll see how that goes. And then we'll do the same thing as we get into the upcoming content about American expansion, the sectional conflict, and things like that. So I guess without any further ado or stalling for time, we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, if you hear any little squeaky sounds in the background, that's probably a cat or 2, because they don't like the idea of me not being around them basically 24/7. So just bear with that too, if you could. So, okay. Hopefully you watched the video about the Adams presidency. That's going to take you basically from the period after Washington to the election of 1800. And even if we were doing this in class, there would be a bit of a gap in there, because the way I approach the courses, we're not going to really do a whole lot about the years 1800 to sort of the 1820s. That's not to say that nothing is happening. Obviously, we've got the War of 1812 in there. You're welcome to look into that kind of stuff or ask me questions about it if you have those. We're not really going to get into that in the class, though. So we're going to start back up with a pretty profound change in American political and social history that happens around the time of Andrew Jackson's emergence on the political scene. And so Jackson's time in power is a period that actually has its own kind of designation. It's one of the few that we can look at like that, that's named after a particular president. And so it is really notable because it's a period when the revolutionary generation, right, those people who were active in the revolution, who were the founding fathers, who were the ones sort of creating the country at the Constitutional Convention, they are leaving politics in one way or another, right? Some of them are dying off. Some of them are at an age where they're just not really capable of being active in politics. In any event, you're starting to see a transition in the 1820s, especially when you no longer have candidates available for major national positions, especially the president, who have a direct link to the creation of the country. And so the problem becomes, how do you determine those people how do you determine the qualifications of the people who will be taking those jobs in the future? It was easy when you said, oh, well, who's the next person in line to be president who was at the creation, who was part of the revolution, who was part of the convention in Philadelphia, but who hasn't been president yet. And so you just kind of go down the list. James Monroe is the last of those presidents who has a direct link to the founding generation itself. When he leaves office in 1825, he's really the last of these people that you can say that about. And so one of the ways that sort of emerges as an option to help select the next people to be candidate for president is the strengthening of a system of political parties. So that video that you watched talks about the Federalists and the Republicans, and their emergence, especially around the end of Washington's second term, and especially around the time of the 1796 election. That is sort of the stepping stone to the solidification of the party system that really gets going in the early 1800s. And it's a way for political leaders in the country, sort of the kingmakers, you could call them, to get the right people into power and block the wrong people from gaining power. So it's not just a matter of who can we rely on to do the right thing, according to the party platform and that sort of thing, but who can we keep away that we don't trust, that we don't want to be in power? And here again, referring back to that video, a good example of that would be somebody like Aaron Burr, right? Aaron Burr, Wood mentions him in the Revolutionary Characters book. He is somebody that is widely distrusted and in some cases hated because he seems to be more interested in self-advancement and self-interest than he is in what's best for the country. And so that's really, really anathema. It's really against the prevailing ideology that dominated a lot of American politics up to that point. So using these parties is as much a way to say, who are we going to get in power that's right, but also how can we stymie the aspirations of political figures who aren't right. And that is going to work relatively well for the first, say, 20 years or so of the 1800s. But during and after the War of 1812, you have this situation where the Federalist Party, which had been the party of Washington and Hamilton and John Adams, some really powerful, prominent figures, it really loses a lot of steam for reasons we're not going to get into a lot. But basically the end result is immediately sort of at the end of the War of 1812 and then through the 1820s, the Democratic-Republican Party, the sort of opposition to the Federalists, is really all by itself. And so whether you're talking about national elections, congressional elections, elections at the state level, the Federalist Party was really pretty weak, and they would pop up here and there, but for the most part, it was going to be those Democratic Republicans who were the ones that voters really had their choice from. The problem, though, with that is just because you have one party doesn't mean that everybody who is running as part of that party has the same ideologies, right? I mean, you can look at that in presidential elections now. I mean, even 2020. If you are paying attention to things like the Democratic primaries, you have a number of different candidates. The field is certainly much narrower now than it was, but a number of different candidates who are all running on the Democratic ticket. They are not exactly identically alike. And that's the same kind of situation that we had in 1824. The Democratic-Republican Party is really the only major party that is functioning. And so voters, when they decide who they want to be president, really they have an option of 4 different people from inside the same party. So you have Andrew Jackson, who was a national figure mainly because of his role in the War of 1812. And he did have some political office, but they were more sort of localized in Tennessee. You have Henry Clay, who was a prominent figure in Kentucky politics. You have John Quincy Adams, who was the son of former President John Adams. And you have a man named William Crawford, who, if I remember right, was a political figure out of New York State. And so in the election of 1824, 3 of those candidates end up splitting the electoral and the popular vote. And so what this means is none of them had enough electoral votes to actually win the presidency straight out, right? So constitutionally, the way that that works is if you have a situation where no person gets a majority of the electoral votes, the decision is left to the House of Representatives, and only the House of Representatives. The thinking is the House is the most representative of the sort of public, right, of the general population. And it just so happens that the other guy who was running for president, who didn't really get electoral votes of any significance, was the Speaker, right? Henry Clay from Kentucky is the Speaker of the House. So Clay has a lot of influence and a lot of, strings to pull and, hands to shake. And he can, if he wants, sort of push the House of Representatives in one direction or another in terms of who's going to end up with the presidency. Excuse me. And the House will be making that decision out of the 3 people with the most electoral votes. And so Jackson, Adams, and Crawford are the ones. So Clay is completely out of the running, but he is the person who can make the decision happen. There ends up then being this sort of arrangement among members of the House of Representatives where John Quincy Adams wins the presidency. And as we'll see on the electoral map that I've got coming up, this is maybe a little bit of a surprise. And almost immediately, when John Quincy Adams is sort of announced, he makes it clear that Henry Clay, the person who happened to be in charge of the House of Representatives, will be John Quincy Adams's Secretary of State. And in the early 1800s, that was basically an automatic stepping stone to the presidency. Excuse me. Pretty much every Secretary of State in every administration leading up to 1824 had gone on to be president. And so the appearance, at least, is this sort of agreement between Adams and Clay, where if Clay delivers the presidency to Adams, then Adams will sort of groom Henry Clay to be the presumptive next president. And people on the outside, especially people in Andrew Jackson's camp, see this as what they call a corrupt bargain, right? They say there's no there's no reason that Adams deserves to be the president. And the sort of quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, seems to be that instead of Clay allowing the House members to make the decision who they want to be president, or, as we'll see from the map coming up, rather than the House making a decision based on the actual results of the election, whether you're looking at popular votes or electoral votes, Jackson's supporters say, rather than any of those things happening, clearly Clay and Adams were in cahoots, and all of a sudden Adams sort of unethically gets awarded the presidency, and unethically then turns right around and grants Henry Clay basically the guarantee that whenever Adams ends being president, right, whenever he is sort of leaving office, Clay will be the nominee, and all of the weight of the Democratic-Republican Party will go behind him. And so Jackson's supporters are furious. But rather than just stopping at being outraged, they begin to organize themselves into an opposition party. And this party will call itself the Democratic Party. And this is the origination of the Democratic Party that we have today. It's kind of ironic. The Republican Party's nickname is the GOP, right? The Grand Old Party. It's actually about 30 years younger than the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is an unbroken line, basically all the way from Jackson and his compatriots all the way down to today. So Jackson is sort of the main person that is part of the Democratic Party at its creation. There are two others who are both fairly prominent politically. You have a guy named Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren is a, he's a senator out of New York State. And you have then a Southerner named John C. Calhoun. And so what you have here is Jackson comes from Tennessee, which in the 1820s is actually the West because of the sort of actual boundaries of the country, because of the population distribution, and so on. Tennessee is considered a Western state. You have a middle state, sort of borderline New England, in Martin Van Buren. And then you have a Southerner in John C. Calhoun. And so the Democratic Party is built around people who are in pretty good position to gather support from all the major areas of the country. They have connections politically, socially, economically with all of these areas. And so they're working almost immediately after the end of the election of 1824 to position Andrew Jackson to win in the election of 1828, if at all possible. And so in the election of 1824, you can see on the map John Quincy Adams in the kind of, light cream color, does really, really well in the Northeast. He manages to get all of New England and manages to get a big chunk of New York State. New York State, in this case, if you can sort of make out, it's a little bit confusing. The electors for New York State sort of divide themselves across the different candidates, right? And so you've got Clay, Crawford, Jackson and Adams that all pull some of the electoral votes from New York State. So John Quincy Adams manages to do really well in the Northeast. Jackson manages sort of a scattering, right? He gets Pennsylvania and New Jersey, he gets the Carolinas, he gets his own state, a couple in what we would call the Midwest, which again at the time was the West. Clay manages some. He gets just barely fourth place when it comes to the electoral votes. He squeaks out about 500 more votes than his competitor Crawford in the popular vote. But if you look at the pie charts, you can see that in both the popular vote and in the electoral vote, who gets the most? Well, it's not John Quincy Adams, right? It's Jackson. Jackson then feels that he has a very legitimate claim to being the president in 1824. If the House of Representatives would have gone into this saying, well, you know, it was split three ways, why don't we just say who has what we would call a plurality, right? Who has the most of any of the people who were running? And Jackson is that person, right? Jackson has 99 electoral votes. Adams has 84. Jackson has over 150,000 popular votes, or Adams has only 108. So in both cases, Andrew Jackson seems like he would have been the, maybe not automatic selection to be president, but a selection to be president that would be understandable. Clay, on the other hand, going back to that corrupt bargain, Clay seems to have made his decision more out of what he can get out of sort of pushing the presidency into one person's hands or another. And that ends up being John Quincy Adams. So Jackson's supporters are understandably upset. They understandably decide they can't work within the Democratic-Republican Party in order to advance their cause. So they create the Democratic Party right after the election of 1824. The next presidential election, then, doesn't have the same kind of arrangement. John Quincy Adams is going to run. He's the incumbent, so he's going to try to get his second term, and Jackson is going to run as his opponent. Direct opponent in a different party now. Instead of just being opponents within the Democratic-Republican Party, now you have John Quincy Adams in what is coming to be called the Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party that exists now. It's just a term that is used that happens to be the same one. So John Quincy Adams is running on the Republican ticket, Jackson is running on the Democratic ticket, and Jackson wins decisively, right? The popular vote, because of the states where John Quincy Adams does well, the popular vote is a little bit closer than the electoral vote. But you can see Jackson's yellow states, lots and lots and lots of them. And once again, the only place where John Quincy Adams really does solidly well is in the Northeast. And even there, Jackson manages to kind of make a dent. You've got a little bit in Maine, but a big chunk in New York State. And so Adams only has one term, just 1825 to 1829. Jackson then wins the election of 1828 pretty decisively. Jackson then will go on to win the election of 1832, also pretty decisively. Clay will continue to try to run for president a number of times in the 1830s and into the 1840s, with no success. Clay never actually becomes president. He will always be a prominent figure, but it will always be at the state level, and especially in the House and in the Senate. So we will definitely come back and make mention of Henry Clay when we talk about some of the compromises as the country is growing, as we're adding new territory and adding new states. He will definitely play a significant role there. He will not be president, though. The next topic, when we get to it, is going to be Jackson as president. Jackson really redefines the way that the presidency operates in a lot of ways. He is a very polarizing figure historically. Lots of American historians like to play this game where we sort of rank the American presidents, best to worst. And Jackson is a hard one to really pin down. We'll get into some of the things that he does in his presidency, some of the challenges that he faces, some of his biography. He's a really interesting guy. But that's going to be in the next section. So make sure before you do the exam, when I make the exam live, make sure that you listen to both of the recorded lectures about the Jackson period, because both of them will be part of the test in one way or another. And so, be taking notes and that kind of thing. Again, I appreciate your attention. I know it's not easy to just sit and listen to one of these things for 25 minutes or a half an hour. If you've got questions at all, be sure that you're sending those emails to me so that I can get you that feedback. And I will see you on the next lecture. Okay? Stay safe, everybody. Be healthy. And that's it for now.